Welcome back to the next episode of TMT with Mike O'Reilly. My guest, James Erwin, Director of Innovation Policy at the Americans for Tax Reform and Executive Director at Digital Liberty. Did I get that right?
Yes. Slam dunk. Good job.
Well, thanks so very much. Let's start our conversation with a little bit of easy questions to begin. What got you to ATR? What in your background and career got you to this moment?
Well, I actually came from Congress, so not as a member, of course. I was a congressional staffer out of college. I'm from Maine originally, and I worked for Senator Collins for about 4 years. Started out actually on the Aging Committee, but I always had an interest in telecom and tech issues. It wasn't necessarily what I wanted to come to DC to do. I was very open-minded about where opportunities took me, and then very quickly I realized everybody who thought they were clever wanted to do national security policy, and it was a far less crowded field to work on domestic policy, which I also found very interesting and sort of equally meritorious anyway. So I was like, oh well, I'll be one of those people. That was a pretty easy decision, but this was kind of as an intern when I was still in college. But after I graduated and began to work under Senator Collins when she was chair of the Aging Committee, and for those who don't know, the Aging Committee, this is the Senate Special Committee on Aging, was set up in the 60s, and it was to study elder care and healthcare, and eventually, they came up with the idea for Medicare, basically, as it is today, and it sort of served its purpose. But instead of going away, it still exists. And it doesn't have any actual jurisdiction over legislation, and it has no oversight authority unless it's bipartisan. So it's effectively a completely toothless, useless committee, except that when you're chair of the Aging Committee, you still get extra staffers. And so it is often used as a training ground for junior members who are sort of rehearsing for a more serious committee chairmanship. Usually you do that through kind of a subcommittee chairmanship on the committee. You're sort of working your way up in seniority, but it was often used as sort of a training ground to be the finance committee chair. It was like there was sort of a pipeline that there used to be there. But it also is, it can be a holding pen for a senior senator who's sort of, especially in the Republican conference, they have term limits on committee chairs. So if you term out of chairing one committee, you can go to Aging if nobody else wants it. It's usually like that person, and this is the case. It was Collins and then like all of the freshmen. It was like Tim Scott was on it, but it was like Josh Hawley when he was new. It was Rick Scott in his first year, first Congress, I guess. I think like Dave McCormick's on it now. So it's definitely like it's where they put kind of the new blood who to learn a little bit about it. But anyway, it's a great place to work because it gives you a lot of opportunities to touch a bunch of different issues that affect seniors. So a lot of our staff worked in healthcare, but I worked on the telecom side of things because of the issue of scams and largely phone scams, but elder fraud, and a lot of it's done through social media as well. So we actually ran a hotline for seniors to call to report their somebody taking advantage of them, usually through romance scams or through government impersonation scams. So a lot of scammers at the time were impersonating the IRS or the Social Security Administration, saying that they needed personal identifying information that they would then sell on the dark web, or the person they were calling would lose their Social Security account. So we were doing a lot of work. This is at the time under Chairman Pai, when you were an FCC commissioner, with Stir Shaken, with a lot of the National Verifier and other programs and protocols to help reduce the traffic from the problem countries, and then trying to identify the gateway providers to crack down on them, because they're, as you are well aware, but perhaps a little bit more obscure knowledge, that most of this traffic comes from overseas. It's Nigerian and Indian call centers that are doing this, but there's a small number of gateway providers whose entire business model is they can charge a tenth of a cent per call they let in, and with a server you can set up a call center in your basement basically to take traffic from the international network and bring it into the domestic network, where it's really difficult to trace. It can only be traced back to the gateway provider. But basically, if you charge a tiny percentage of a cent on every single call you let through, and you let in billions and billions of calls. That's where all the scam and spam traffic is coming from. So we were working on that, and that was sort of the beginning of my interest in FCC issues. Although I should mention I was a college radio DJ before that, and on the board of our radio station, where I was the compliance officer and actually had to call a couple of communications lawyers in D.C. This is actually my first introduction when I was like 20, to make sure that our license was up to date and everything, and that we weren't violating the law. But I've always considered this a really important issue, and one that, or suite of issues, I should say, and one I'm very happy to be working on.
You mentioned your time in Congress. Do you miss the institution, or are you happy to have moved on from the good work that was happening there to a think tank, to a thoughtful leadership role?
I think that, well, thank you. I hope some people think what I have to say is valuable, but I think there's almost no better first job to have out of college. If you go to college and you're going into a professional setting, I think it is such good training. They work you so hard. You learn to be incredibly diligent. You learn how industrious you need to be, how disciplined you need to be. You learn just the work ethic. You learn how to establish relationships. You learn how to deal, probably most helpfully, you learn how to deal with some incredibly neurotic people. Because everybody's employment hinges on the senator or the congressman winning re-election. Senator and the congressman has to be, oftentimes, sometimes they're in very safe seats and it's fine, but they often have to be extremely concerned with their reputation. And I guess I worked for a member who was probably the most extreme example of this, but being a Republican representing an increasingly blue state and a moderate, she had to be very careful about what she said. Which naturally, that's just her personality anyway. But it serves her well, and you couldn't do anything to embarrass her. And your employment kind of depends on that, and everybody around you's employment depends on that. And so there's a lot of anxiety that comes with it. So learning how to manage that and learning how to perform well, learn a lot about a wide variety of subjects very quickly, just enough to know if somebody's trying to put one over on you, but not so much that you have to write everything, all the laws from scratch yourself, because there are lawyers on staff and permanent people that work on that sort of thing. So I think it's excellent training for that. I wouldn't recommend it long term. I don't think it's good for your health, but it's a great experience, and it's a great launching point to get into more gainful employment, because they also don't pay you very much. But it's a great thing to do when you're 22 to 25, because you can afford to live that way at that time in your life, and you will learn so much, and it will just form good habits that will serve you in every other office job you'll ever have in the future, which will probably not be as demanding in terms of like the daily stress, and will also pay you more. Nowadays, I work downtown, and what I found to be one of the greatest advantages of that is we get to kind of go at our own pace, work on our own projects, decide what we want to invest our time in. We're not just responding to events. That's kind of one of the big downsides of working on the Hill. Great experience that it is. You are always responding to events. It is entirely reactionary. And here we do what we can to shape them. Obviously, it's both. It's push and pull, but we do what we can to advance an agenda and try and influence more minds than just one member that you're working for. You can have a really good personal relationship with a member if you work in Congress, but that's one vote you're influencing. We cast a wider net, and what I found to be, frankly, the most surprising aspect of this job is that I have a much wider audience and more sway than I ever thought I would, between executive branch officials, legislative officials, members of Congress, staffers. You can have a lot more influence, at least in helping guide how people think, or at least giving them something to consider, even if they end up disagreeing with you, than you ever do as a staffer. So I think it's great training, but it's not necessarily where you want to be long term.
ATR, you think of taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Taxes has sometimes an overlap with communication policy, but not a ton. Why has ATR maintained such a prominent role in communication policy, to have a staff position financed and really be an outspoken leader in the topic? So
taxes obviously are our central issue, but the purpose of the organization has always been to carry forward the Reagan domestic agenda. So a lot of history on that, and I'll try not to go on too long, but the modern taxpayer movement more or less began around 1978. I mean, this is sort of a subset of the wider conservative and libertarian movement that was growing up out of sort of the fusionism of Frank Meyer was writing about National Review in the 50s, and sort of what William F. Buckley and Barry Goldwater and ultimately Ronald Reagan were pushing, and it had various strains. But 1978, we have Prop 13 in California. And that was this big statewide referendum where the voters of California limited how property tax could be assessed going forward, and limiting the rate of increase of property taxes. They never got to income tax in California, but their property taxes are pretty significantly restrained. So, and that was an effort that former Governor Reagan was getting behind, and it was a big success. Out of that, you get the National Taxpayer Union, which they're still around. They work just down the street. But NTU began setting up a series of chapters and trying to expand the Prop 13 push through referenda in various other states, basically trying to spread that movement. Our founder and president, Grover Norquist, worked for NTU for several years. He worked for the College Republicans for several years. And then in 1986, President Reagan asked him to form Americans for Tax Reform. It was an idea that was sort of cooked up in the Reagan White House as they were trying to figure out how to better engage grassroots, because while NTU was focusing on state referenda, on changing tax codes and sort of enshrining taxpayer protections in state constitutions, there wasn't really a lobby group here in DC that was focusing on Congress and getting the major tax cut legislation that Reagan was pushing for in the 80s over the line. You have to remember, Reagan takes office, the top marginal income tax rate is 70% still. So this is like over 2/3 of the income of the top earners are being confiscated by the government. And, in effect, that you've hit diminishing returns pretty quickly there. People's wealth will not be reported as income. It will be found in other ways if you're confiscating that much. This is the Laffer curve, is like if you reduce taxation to below 50%, the optimal rate is unknown, but probably around 1/3. That's where you maximize the amount of returns you get. And this is something that, Art Laffer gets a lot of credit for it, but it's something that was observed by Ibn Khaldun, the great Berber or Amazigh writer, a scholar of the 13th century, looking at how over time the dynasties in the Muslim Caliphate would always have enormous revenues and swollen treasuries when their dynasty began, but as taxes increased, several generations later, the treasuries were always diminished and they were frequently in debt. And it wasn't simply a matter of fighting more wars. It was which was what largely government spending was on back then. It was the changes in taxation. Charles V found the same thing in Spain. That was sort of the cash cow of what was then the Habsburg Empire. And of course the silver from the New World that the Spanish Empire was mining. They were flooding the European market with silver and causing hyperinflation, and they couldn't understand why constantly bringing in more silver and adding to the pool of silver that was being traded kept lowering the value. And they sort of got caught in this doom loop where they had to keep importing more silver to keep up, but that just kept devaluing silver even more. At the same time he was doing that, he kept raising taxes over and over again on his own people in his actual Spanish kingdoms, where they were being, they had this huge infusion of capital from the New World in the silver, self-defeating as that ultimately ended up being. That enabled them to be an extremely productive, at least by medieval terms, workforce to tax for several generations. And his advisors kept pleading with him to stop raising taxes because they were getting less and less money every time they did. The tax revenues were declining as his taxes were going up. So it's something it's a phenomenon that's been observed all over the world, and that's sort of what we work on here. Your question was about communications policy, though, so we'll get back around to that.
I didn't think you were going to go there, but I appreciate you did. Circle us back.
Yeah, so Reagan takes office in 1981, so 600 years later, and is there's a great actually interview where you can see him with I think Tom Brokaw. That was sort of his last year in office, where he talks about Ibn Khaldun and how this has been observed for so long. So he's coming to office with this mindset, and at the same time you have Jack Kemp in the House really pushing this big tax cut. And they ended up using reconciliation to get it through so they wouldn't have to get 60 votes in the Senate. At the time, there's divided government. You have Republicans in the Senate, you have Democrats in the House. There's a fascinating story about Stan Rostenkowski, who was from Illinois. He was kind of a blue dog Democrat, fiscally conservative, certainly. He was sold in the tax cut by Jack Kemp. He was the Ways and Means chair, so he gets behind it. And then Phil Gramm, who later switched parties, but at the time was a Democrat from Texas, who was the chair of the Budget Committee, was happy to use reconciliation as a mechanism to pass it because he supported it too. And basically, Kemp was able to outflank Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House, who was a liberal Democrat from Massachusetts, didn't have ideologically coherent parties yet. And there were liberal Republicans that voted against the bill ultimately, and there were the liberal Republicans in the Senate probably gave Reagan more trouble in his entire tenure than the Democrats in the House ever did. But basically, because O'Neill was going to lose control over his own caucus, he decided to cut a deal with Reagan and said, all right, we'll pass this. Let me see if I can mitigate the damage instead of having a protracted fight, embarrassing fight with my own members here, my own committee chairs. And so they passed it through reconciliation, but the deal was, to make it work in reconciliation, you have to cut spending. So there were domestic spending cuts, which Reagan had come in, campaigning for as well. But the cuts will happen today. The spending cuts will happen today. The tax cut will phase in over 3 years. So we'll have a 5% cut for this tax year, we'll have a 5% cut for next year, and then we'll have a 10% cut after that. And that was the deal Reagan kind of had to take in order to get his policy over the line. What did that mean? It meant that at the same time that the Volcker shock is happening, so we had 12% inflation, Federal Reserve jacks up interest rates to stop it, basically intentionally forcing a recession that helps reduce inflation because consumer spending goes down. At the same time, you get spending cuts to domestic, like social safety net programs. It's very unpopular. And guess what? People are not getting their tax cut this year before 1982 in the midterms. So because he was forced to take the deal of phasing it in, Reagan takes a political hit, Republicans take a political hit, Democrats do very well in 82 in the midterms because the economy is not doing well. The safety net's been cut. The tax cut has not taken effect yet. Tax cut takes full effect by 1983, and that's where you suddenly see this economic boom. I think there was 8% growth that year or something. And that continues all the way, a couple of recessions here and there, but that basically continues until the year 2000. Throughout the 80s and 90s, you have this great period of economic growth and prosperity brought in by this tax cut. But the work wasn't done. And when they came back the second time in Reagan's second term, and there's a great book about this everyone should read called The Showdown at Gucci Gulch, which goes through a painstaking history of how all of this happened and all the backing and forthing and parliamentary maneuvering. But ultimately, there was another bipartisan tax reform that was far more permanent, that eliminated a lot of deductions and loopholes and write-offs and everything that had been lobbied for under the oppressively high tax rates, while bringing the top rate down to 28%. So Reagan leaves office with a 28% top marginal income tax rate, down from 70% when he takes office, and allowing people to keep more of their own money, leads to more investment, more job growth, and I think the results speak for themselves. We have the prosperity I was born into in the 1990s, which was great. But in order to accomplish that, basically the lessons they had learned from 81 was you needed to have your own lobby group in DC that was advocating for the taxpayer, and that's what we do. So the White House guys came up with this idea. They had several groups that they tried to stand up on various issues, but ATR was formed specifically to get this bill over the line, and to do it, Grover Norquist, the young man they tapped to, was younger than I am now at the time, to start to preside over this organization that he's still running today. The idea was the Taxpayer Protection Pledge, which is we'll get all the Republican members, and we had some Democrats back in the beginning too, to pledge I will never vote for a net tax increase. So I will get rid of deductions as long as there's a commensurate reduction in the rate, but I will not, and I will oppose all tax increases as a matter of principle. And getting that as sort of the starting position for negotiations was what they needed to get the bill over the line. And ultimately, a majority of Republicans ended up signing it. A majority of Republicans have still signed it today. And since the early 90s, when about 80% got on board, you have the Republican Revolution. There are various reasons for that, but not a small piece of it was the rebranding of the Republican Party as the party that will not raise your taxes. Led to the Republicans taking the House for the first time in 40 years in 1994. Newt Gingrich and Grover have always been close and have worked together on spreading this gospel. And ever since then, Republicans have controlled the House of Representatives and the Senate more often than not, after a 62-year period where they controlled both houses for a grand total of 4 years on 2 occasions. And there's a lovely chart Grover loves to show everybody that I didn't bring with me. But either way, that was the centerpiece of the Reagan domestic agenda. But at the same time, in his 8 years in office, 50% of the regulatory burden on the American people was repealed. I think it was 50% of the pages in the Federal Register were eliminated by his regulators, trying to liberate our economy from decades of New Deal and Great Society sort of micromanagey stuff from the busybodies that end up in the swamp. Much of it from the FCC. And most important among those was, of course, the 1987 repeal of the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine originated in the 1960s, very explicitly as a ploy by the Union thugs that were the allies of the Kennedy administration to kick right-wing broadcasters off the air. There's a great book that Paul Matzko of the Cato Foundation has written, or Cato Institute, I should say, has written, called the Radio Right, which is about how there actually was right-wing talk radio way back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but in the early 60s it all but disappeared with this rule from the FCC that if you ever said anything about a political position or about a politician or about a public figure, the station had to give them free equal time to respond to your claim, which effectively bankrupted all of these small radio stations that were carrying like the Christian Crusade, or there's a whole bunch of these sort of evangelical, largely originally, and then increasingly conservative political, oil magnate funded radio stations that were really the only voice of opposition against the Democrat establishment that was running Washington, as we mentioned, for 60 years straight, basically. And so taking away that monopoly on telecommunication power from the establishment media, and allowing the birth of basically AM talk radio as we know it today, with Rush Limbaugh, with the rise of Fox News, where they didn't have to adhere to a fairness doctrine or equal time rule. You now have a much more competitive media environment, and of course with the internet, that's all gone out the window anyway. But all of this to say is that ATR was originally founded for the 1986 tax bill, but have always supported deregulatory efforts, and we've always supported the media freedom agenda of the Reagan administration, and we're still carrying all of that forward until it's fully completed, which who knows when that will be, but we're trying to bring all of those great ideas to fruition, many of which take decades to achieve.
Well, then maybe bring us up to today. Mm-hmm. You follow the FCC, and when you look at the industry that's being regulated, do you find one that has too many burdens, has a room to remove obligations that no longer make any sense? That Chairman Carr has his delete proceeding to strip away those burdens that no longer should be in the FCC's rule books. What is your take on the level of regulatory burden for industry and Chairman Carr's efforts to remove some of those burdens that no longer make any sense?
Yeah, I think it's excellent. It's called delete. So it's just a wholesale gutting of outdated and obsolete regulations that the FCC has piled up over the years. Many of these are some of them were dormant rulemakings, where rulemaking was initiated, no final rule was ever adopted, but it's always there in case they want to pounce at any time. So closing those, so you'd have to restart the public consultation process, is a great idea. The number of reporting requirements that broadcasters and cable companies have to go through, and the hoops you have to jump through just to transfer a license between two willing parties every time they sell, or even if it's ownership within a family is passed from father to son, or between two siblings, or anything like that, you have to report to the FCC, and they sort of have a potential veto over a lot of this stuff. And so getting them out of the way and allowing people to just sort of dispose of their property as they see fit, I think is excellent. You ask if the industry is overregulated. I think that there's a horrific imbalance between the legacy systems and new technology. So talking about legacy technology, broadcast television had the great misfortune to grow up during the New Deal era, and kind of really explode in the 50s and 60s, but at a time when this regulation first, or regulation forward mentality prevailed and obtained in the federal bureaucracy and really nationwide. The reason why we had three broadcasters for so long was because the regulatory burden was such that it was impossible for anyone to break into the market. There were so many attempts at a competitive fourth network that rose and fell very quickly. And one of them that I want to write a book on someday is the Dumont television network, which is a really fascinating story of an early 50s TV competitor that was considered a major network for a few years, but just never quite broke through against ABC, CBS, and NBC, which are all fine networks, but there was room for more competition. And we know this because when rules were relaxed after the Reagan administration, you did see immediately the advent of the Fox network. So now there are 4 networks. And at the same time, competitive pressures from cable came along. So broadcasters are operating under rules that were devised during World War II. There's this crazy artificial restriction of how many broadcast stations you could own that exists. It operates under the logic that a television monopoly will exist if one person buys up 3 broadcast stations in a local market. It's a rule written for a world where there's no cable TV, there's no satellite, and there's no internet. And they're operating under these legacy rules that are going to destroy their industry if they're not allowed to consolidate against their new competitors in Netflix and Amazon Prime, and of course on basic cable they've been competing with for a very long time. Cable had the good fortune to grow up kind of in the 70s and 80s, largely delayed by broadcast regulations that were applied to this with great suspicion to this new technology. But they're less regulated than broadcasters, but still very much so.
Well, you had the 92 Cable Act, which was
yes.
how to put a vice on their industry.
Exactly, yeah. And it's never happened to the internet. The internet had the great fortune to come up in the great free market heyday of the 90s and early 2000s. So, really 80s and 90s, I guess. So really it's a matter of timing, depending on when your industry was born, dictates how regulated you are. And it's completely arbitrary. It's an arbitrary force of history. What was the prevailing ideology or mentality of the day? And as a result, you have a tremendous imbalance between the internet, which I think is properly largely unregulated, especially because it's not really dealing with any durable goods or industrial machinery, right? It's all information, and when we're talking about a sphere of information, the First Amendment should be held as sacrosanct as reasonably possible. That should obtain in broadcast as much as it should in cable, as much as it should on the internet, and yet broadcast television is an extremely heavily regulated realm of speech and communications, where the First Amendment is often a secondary concern to ideas about the public interest and news distortion and other rules. Now, again, there's a logic to it, which comes from the fact that broadcasters are using the public airwaves because we have a finite amount of radio frequency spectrum, which is like one of the chief things I work on here. You have to give exclusive licenses to use it, otherwise they would bleed into each other and it wouldn't really work, and you at least need an office to register the licenses, right? The very least, that's what the FCC should exist for. Many of those were given away for free back in the old days when we had beauty contests, as they were called, where basically you'd go in and you'd say, I deserve a TV license because this is what I will broadcast. And because of that, you basically got it for free. You could become a millionaire overnight, pretty much, and you'd have no real competition in a local market sometimes. But what you had to do was agree to, do an hour of news every night, do children's programming and Saturday mornings, like all these things we sort of take for granted about like the nightly news or like the Saturday morning cartoons and other when prime time begins, i.e. when you can start showing some more salacious material that children shouldn't be seeing, what hour game shows are on, all of that was just part of commitments that were made by broadcasters in the early days of the medium in order to get their licenses. Nowadays, we auction licenses. We have a competitive bidding process that adheres to market economics and an actual model for effectively divvying up a scarce resource, which has won a Nobel Prize in economics for very good reason. In that environment, you don't regulate what people are going to say because they're not getting a free license on condition of using the public airwaves. They've paid for it, so it's their property now. They have a property right to use this. I mean, they don't own the spectrum, but they have a property right to the license to use it, and therefore you shouldn't be regulating them. So now the question is it fair or just under the First Amendment, or reasonable under as a jurisprudential matter, which I do not have a law degree, so I'm the first in my family to not. So I have no strong opinions about that. But does it make sense to continue to saddle broadcasters who are getting outcompeted by new technologies anyway with this imbalanced regulatory burden, or would it make more sense to allow them to really scale up and compete in the same level that the other technologies can? Talk
a little bit about broadband, how it's regulated. Under the current structure. The underlying network is regulated one way, then you go through door A. If it's regulated a different way, you go through door B. When essentially the service is the same for the consumer. What do you think about regulatory symmetry? Should we try and regulate those services likewise, or is the underlying network so different that it's impossible to do so?
There are a few reasons why you might have a reason for different regulation, especially when it comes to what are you doing physically. Are you building a cell tower? Are you putting a fiber optic cable underground? Or are you launching a satellite into space, right? To the extent that heavy industry is involved, you will have different regulations. It's almost inevitable. The question of internet service itself being regulated, no. I mean, there's no reason for it to be any different. It's the same logic as with what I was just talking about with television and streaming and the internet. You are as regulated. You are regulated based on when your technology was born. So wireline technology is regulated in a very 20th century public utility sort of way. Wireless technology is regulated in a very 1990s Communications Act logic. And now we have satellites, which basically the FCC grants licenses to launch them, and that's about it. I mean, they have certainly some leverage, they have some touch points, they can abuse those, as you saw somewhat in the Biden administration, where they wanted to revoke, they did everything they could to prevent SpaceX from launching more satellites because they didn't like what Elon Musk was saying about free speech on Twitter. So by virtue of when the technology came along, they are differently regulated. There's some logic to the underlying hardware, but when it comes to the service they're providing, there really should be no difference between whether you're getting your internet through a hardline cable, through spectrum that comes from space, or through spectrum that comes from land somewhere.
You can't talk about broadband in the current moment without talking about BEAD, the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Act. I think I've got that right.
Yeah.
But you were instrumental in negotiating parts of BEAD as part of the legislative process. The Biden Infrastructure Act, your boss was one of the participants in framing it. Were you troubled by or insulted with how the Biden administration implemented it? And are you surprised that the Trump administration was able to come forth and relatively improve upon a number of things to make it more cost efficient and potentially, depending on your view, more effective? Well,
first of all, I was only instrumental insofar as I was an instrument involved in the drafting, merely a functionary, but it was a great learning experience. And from that, I can say I'm not surprised, certainly disappointed, but the way that the Biden administration implemented the BEAD program was effectively trying to resurrect all of the rules that they were unable to pass legislatively. And you see this so often. You can't get it through Congress. That's okay. We'll just do it through executive branch guidance. And they were especially pernicious in their sort of the soft tyranny of your guidelines and a scoring rubric. And it's not like, well, you don't have to do this, but if you don't, we're going to give you a bad score and not give you your money. So I have to do this. No, it's guidelines. It's just guidance. And so you got to this point where you literally had Virginia going to court, taking the NTIA to court to get their BEAD money because they didn't want to fix prices. And rate regulation, which is price fixing for internet service, we explicitly rejected that when we were drafting the bill. The Democrats wanted it. The Republicans did not want it. To get a bipartisan product, they had to drop that. We had to make concessions on our side too. But with a Democrat president, they just went ahead and tried to ram that stuff through anyway. And predictably, it raised the cost, it slowed down the process, and in the 3 years from signing the bill to leaving office, the Biden administration was not able to connect a single home to broadband. We still don't have any, although that's going to hopefully happen this year. This is the great goal of 2026, is I think we are going to finally see BEAD money go out the door because the Trump administration, in the space of 1 year, their appointees came in, they rewrote the whole program, they stripped it down to what it was meant to be according to congressional intent, and they found that they could save literally half the money that had been appropriated for it. $42 billion, they're saving $21 billion that now can be returned to the taxpayer, and they're going to finally get these builds going out the door. I think that it's pretty self-explanatory, but when you allow the price and scarcity of internet service and the cost of doing that to be mediated and what's the word I'm looking for? Reconciled by the price mechanism, you've reached your max efficiency. When you drop the prevailing wage standards that were never written into the bill, and allow people to pay what the local market rate for labor is, rather than paying inflated wages, you save the taxpayer money. When you drop an explicit preference for fiber, which the Biden administration added to the program because they claimed that the wireless technologies were not proven enough or something like that, didn't upset the cable companies because in their mind, they were, no matter what, best positioned to win the bids to build out broadband where they already had infrastructure in place. And in places where they'd be building out into the middle of nowhere over many miles, they didn't think it was worth it. So it was they honestly had, the industry itself was not even lobbying for the fiber preference for the most part. And dropping it just opened up the competitive bidding process so much more, and that's what drove the cost down across the board. That probably was the single greatest factor in saving $20 billion, which is not something the federal government does very often. So
what should the federal government do with these savings, or $21 billion in what's now called non-deployment dollars? I think the NTIA has made clear that states are likely to get their funding, but they want to make sure the funding is not abused. Where do you fall on that?
So there are some allowable uses of non-deployment funds in the bill. We didn't really like that in the final product. Again, this is a compromise, both sides making concessions. I think that it should go back to the taxpayer. It should be used to offset the deficit somewhere. People say that it should go to deficit reduction. That doesn't really mean anything. It just means you send it to the Treasury so the Treasury can just use the money for some other obligation, right? Which is not going back to the taxpayer. They're not getting a tax rebate, but it does mean that that's a tax you're not raising somewhere else, or it's money you're not borrowing. So absolutely, this should go to deficit reduction in that sense. There are a couple of allowable expenses that I'm sure states will go to court to get the money for, and they probably will have a case to get some of it. Whether that extends all the way to buying tablets for school children, that's debatable under the bill text. That was and ended up being somewhat, I don't want to say it was deliberately ambiguous, but that ended up being somewhat ambiguous because the two sides couldn't really agree and wanted to get a product out there. So we'll see how that shakes out. I'd be very curious to see what the judiciary has to say about it. But at the end of the day, these savings, it's a great thing. There's no reason to go wasting $20 billion on additions to a program if your core mission is completed. And we fully support the efforts by the NTIA to send a rescissions package to Congress, see if they can get the money struck from our expenditures. There is, however, one exception I would like to flag right now, which is apparently there's some talk of using the BEAD non-deployment funds, the $21 billion in savings, as a hook for AI preemption. So one of the other issues we're working on is the growth of artificial intelligence, which is already beginning to show that it can be extremely helpful in raising worker productivity. It's extremely helpful in streamlining systems in the back end and making the average American worker just so much more productive. I mean, to get real GDP growth of any sustained level, you either need your population to grow, your workforce to expand, or you need your average worker to get more productive. And AI will enable us to do the latter if we can't do the former, because even with immigration, the US population is starting to plateau as the global population is starting to plateau with collapsing birth rates. So didn't think we'd go there, did you? But anyways, AI is essential to winning the future because of that. So allowing states to come in and create a patchwork of 50 different state laws regulating AI is going to be impossible for developers, and it's going to really hinder our potential. So a federal standard is necessary. It's clearly interstate commerce. I don't think that there's a real federalist argument against it, except politicians in states saying, I want to be the guy who's regulating this. Not, I have a really clear case under the 10th Amendment, because you don't, because under the Commerce Clause, it's, I want to be the one who's doing this. Okay. So, well, we have to stop you from doing that, because you're gonna become a national security threat as the governor of whatever state. So using the non-deployment funds as effectively as an inducement, but bribe would be another word you could use, to get states, hey, you can have these non-deployment funds for whatever goodies or slush funds you want, just don't regulate AI, would probably be a net positive, just given the economic growth potential of AI in the long run.
What do you think about the arguments that are put forward, doomsday arguments about what AI, the bad things it will be on employment, or the death of the human race? Yes. I mean, whatever projections they may have about AI, you obviously seem to be a fan of AI, or at least what it may lead to. What do you say to those that have a different viewpoint?
When I say I'm a fan of AI, I think there's a lot of really cool applications, but I also, I want to make it clear, like, I'm more just have the epistemic humility to know that, like, I don't know what's going to happen, and to know that historically people who catastrophize or imagine doomsday scenarios in the face of new technology are always wrong. Just historically speaking, that's what happens. So it makes more sense just to trust in the decentralized decision-making of millions of individuals. This is what Hayek's entire career was built on. It's not possible for any committee of bureaucrats or council of elected officials to possibly foresee every problem that's going to happen or every opportunity that's going to arise. So we're going to constantly be fighting the last war in a regulatory sense, which is always what happens across industries. It is better to let it run free, and if you encounter a real problem down the line, then fine, we can regulate, we can update our laws, but there aren't any new crimes that are going to be invented. AI might be used to commit existing crimes that you can prosecute people for, and then if you need to make adjustments to law, and copyright's a big area where there needs to be some sort of resolution to that dispute. That's sort of a property rights conflict of visions. Totally makes sense, but it's not as much I'm a fan as it is I just don't believe in doomsday scenarios. I'm generally skeptical of them, and I don't think we can possibly know.
How about the benefit side?
Yeah. So the benefits, I do think that there might be something of a bubble right now. Maybe I've already been proven wrong, that there hasn't been a huge collapse in the capital accretion in that sector of the economy, but ChatGPT lost 70% of its users in June of 2025, and then suddenly saw them all come back in like September. Kind of tells you something. Who's using ChatGPT? It's students. Summer vacation started, and suddenly their numbers cratered. Okay, so I think the chatbots might be a little overhyped. Where I'm more excited is in the incredibly boring bureaucratic side of AI. How quickly can we redact documents that have been subpoenaed and need to be released, right? It used to be you had a clerk going through with a Sharpie. You can have an AI algorithm do it and then just have one person check it. There are stories of county clerks that used to spend all day redacting a single document can now do one per hour because all they're doing is proofreading and making sure that the algorithm didn't make a mistake. That is the perfect example of one person who's not losing their job capable of doing it much faster and putting out a greater productivity, right?
Are there sectors that you see where, I think of something like healthcare, where AI is going to transform, or could transform if used in the right circumstance?
I think healthcare is the best case we can be making for AI right now. I think of three main reasons. Number one, it is already powering enormous breakthroughs in stroke victims being able to walk and talk again, in the prosthetic breakthroughs and robotics breakthroughs. There's so much to be excited about, so much life-saving and quality of life-saving care that is now that we can now give more accurate diagnoses. One great application of chatbots, they actually tend to have better bedside manner than actual physicians, who are still necessary for diagnostics because the algorithms have proven people were a little overly optimistic about, for example, reading radiation slides, and so there's a big boom in the radiation profession right now because you have to read your images. It was thought that AI could do it, and so there was this huge glut, a bumper crop of requests. Like doctors started requesting more of them because they thought it'd be faster and more efficient. Turns out they weren't that accurate. So now is a great time to be a radiologist because they're getting a whole bunch of more work because they have to double check everything. But anyway, that might peter off eventually. It's boom times in radiology for your med school is all I have to say. But it might not be a 30-year career. Anyway, so I think that's an enormous one enormous breakthrough in the healthcare field. My wife to be, who is currently in med school, did her PhD in radiology, in immunology oncology, computational biology, I guess is the proper term. But basically, she was using machine learning to crunch large numbers. So you're able to process more data and do more analyses that contribute to long-term scientific breakthroughs faster. It's just simply making the nuts and bolts of scientific discovery more efficient. She has a CS background from her undergrad, but so she knows how to code, but she thinks that chatbots are extremely useful for coding. And so she was constantly having to write programs to do different analyses and figure out if she could build a model that would accurately predict the behavior of cancer cells in a tumor. And chatbots made it so much faster to say, write me a code that does this. And they can do it quickly and extremely accurately. The ability of AI algorithms to just process more information and render images faster, and it's helping us do our wedding invites faster. Like there's so many like small things that, when you think about pen and paper, or you think about how Microsoft Word or MS Paint was a breakthrough there. It's just the next level of that, right? It's not so much replacing human intelligence as making redundant tasks very, very easy. And then the third area in healthcare that I think is really fascinating is when it comes to affordability, which is the great buzzword right now for everybody. Health insurance is a totally captured industry by the government. It's completely ridiculous. Nobody can understand it. Nobody can navigate the thicket of claims and counterclaims and who owes what to whom. You can build an AI algorithm that will quickly and accurately match patients with their claim. Help patients understand what they're actually covered for and recommend a treatment plan and price it out for them. The opacity, is that the word? Yes. The opacacy, maybe that's, anyway. I was trying to think, there's got to be another word for that, right?
Opaqueness?
The opaqueness, but the declarification process, the result of the declarification process of healthcare billing and claims. That entire barrier in our economy can be busted through by AI and introduce genuine competition, price competition, back into the healthcare sphere, driving the cost to the consumer way, way, way down. And it won't be a boom. Boom times might be over for the insurance industry that's currently profiting off of government largesse, but they'll still be around, and they can start competing with each other on affordability of plan and quality of care and accuracy of price and accuracy of billing using AI, that the consumer has this tool to advocate for them against the insurance companies. And you end up with a much healthier marketplace and ultimately a healthier body politic, healthy in a literal sense, but also in a political sense, as healthcare CEOs appear to be targets of assassinations these days. I think AI, honestly, crazy as it may be to say this, but AI might be the solution to the future Luigi Mangionis of the world.
God bless. 2 questions and I'll let you go. One, totally switching topics. You testified May of last year on the issue of National Public Radio. I want to get your thoughts on what's happened to public broadcasting as a whole and how does that fit into your vision? And where do you think this has gone in the last 18 months or so?
Yeah, I think, so just the other day we had news that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is not NPR and it's not PBS, but it is the government corporation that funnels money to them. And this is the one that's completely taxpayer funded. There are no claims about, it's only 1% of our budget. It's totally taxpayer funded. This is like the corporate board that oversees them. They disincorporated, which was kind of just like an epilogue or a final coda on the story of defunding public media, or state-owned media, really. That they had already ceased operations and laid off all of their staff. Last year, this is like, they're just at the point now where they can disincorporate. So it's sort of the final nail in the coffin in the death of these outmoded institutions from the Great Society era I was referring to earlier. You had this really concentrated broadcast industry. And as was often the case with big government types, is like they will impose regulations that make it impossible for competitors to enter a marketplace, and then complain that there aren't enough competitors, so we have to subsidize one that's government created. That's exactly what happened with NPR and PBS. Government created media outlets to provide the sort of highbrow cultural offerings and intellectual discourse that they claimed that the TV networks were not capable of doing, and that the American people were too stupid to want for themselves, and so we have to subsidize it. Now, as soon as you had real competition with cable, the Arts and Entertainment Channel, it's now A&E, became a thing. There were cable channels dedicated to opera, to home decor and home crafts, and there were the Turner Classic Movies. Like, high art is actually popular, or at least can get enough of an audience to sustain a cable channel, if you would just let the market run its course. But when you force the market to concentrate, everything has to be a middle-brow offering, and that just builds the case for a taxpayer-funded elite nonsense. And if you see, today, I mean, we're doing a podcast right now. Everybody knows Mother has a podcast, which is a long-form conversational style, sort of in the vein of Firing Line on PBS. And so I think the market clearly sustains the types of offerings that PBS, that they claim PBS was necessary to deliver to the people, and use that as the excuse to have a government-funded propaganda organ for the Democratic Party. And I really make no bones about this, because in the 90s they were caught literally sharing donor lists with state chapters of the Democratic Party. It was clear whose side they were on, even if they did host a conservative every now and then. You had Milton Friedman had a great series. As I said, Buckley did Firing Line for decades. So don't want to obfuscate that, but which I think is the word I was looking for, the obfuscation. But the fact remains that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting disincorporated. And yet, we still have NPR and PBS. They're not gone. And I don't think they're going away, because I think there's a market for them. They have a very affluent slice of the American public likes to listen to and watch them. They have been effectively running ads with their corporate sponsors for decades at this point, while at the same time claiming they don't advertise and need your tax dollars. And they already have this massive advantage over all their competitors of being a nonprofit that can take tax-free donations from the people who want to hear that stuff. And so I think it's a brilliant model, and I'm very happy for them to thrive as a nonprofit, and I like some of their content and will continue to consume it. I just don't want to be forced to pay for it at the end of the year when I file my income taxes, or I guess really, I'll be honest, at the end of the first quarter when I file my taxes. I don't wait till April 14th, but I usually not before March. So anyway, there is a market for what they're offering. I think that despite the wailing and gnashing of teeth that surrounded the fight to defund them, we have been already completely vindicated in that the government organ is gone. The networks are still here. They're still producing content. Nobody has been shut down. I don't think there's a single record of, there may be one or two, like very small, very rural stations that have shut down, but there has not been. If this was a real problem, if there was a widespread, you would hear about it on the news every single day, and PBS and NPR would not be able to shut up about all of their affiliates closing down. But they're not, because people want to listen to them, and they have a customer base. And I think that is the greatest vindication of this project we could possibly get. I'm very happy and wish them all the success going forward without my money.
Last question of our video cast. When you look out for the rest of 26 and into 27, what's one or maybe two issues that you see that might be not on anyone else's mind right now?
Oh, I think, the one that is on everybody's mind is AI. I think that's going to continue to be a real problem. We do have to...
Not the technology.
Not the technology, but the regulating. Yes, thank you. But yeah, we do need to get a federal preemption, and the Trump issued an executive order that's sort of pushing in the right direction, but and the AI action plan is great, and it sort of follows on the sort of statement of principle from the first Trump administration, which the Biden people walked back, and then had the unions and the sort of woke race communists rewrite in their own way. But it's back to first principles, back to a good sort of free market outlook on a pro-innovation, a permissionless innovation, if I may borrow our friend Adam Terrier's phrase. So it's in a good place. I think that's a good EO. Unfortunately, it's not a durable solution because the next president can overturn it. And the idea of having the DOJ try and chill state regulation by threatening lawsuits that they don't want to, the states presumably don't want to burden their taxpayers with defending, that will work in most places, certainly in most smaller states where it's just not something they have the bandwidth for. you'll pardon my pun. It will not work on the states that are going to be the real problem, because the real problem is California, kind of New York, but really California, because if California regulates technology in a certain way and there's no federal preemption, the industry will follow California. That's the largest market, and that's where they live. You know, there's been some movement to Austin, but Silicon Valley is still the heart of the tech industry in America, and that's who they're going to comply with. So other states are going to have to fall in line with them in the same way that the auto industry had to fall in line with California and their emission standards, which is a really ironic story of where in the 70s, Governor Reagan managed to get an exemption for California so they didn't have to follow EPA emission standards, and then they could basically use their market power to drive the rest of the country away from those. And then now they're doing it in reverse, where they're over-regulating emissions, and then everybody else, a bunch of states have entered a compact with them, and now that whole thing's been overturned. Anyway, but the...
So AI is on everyone's mind.
AI is on everybody's mind.
Give me one that's not.
What is not is space. I think you are starting to hear about it somewhat, but I don't think that people are quite prepared for how much this is going to heat up in the next few years. The demand for satellites providing internet service and providing communications links is only going to increase. There's a good reason we have a Space Force now to sort of start projecting power into that realm, just to at least make sure that our assets are protected up there. But you're going to see a lot more. There hasn't been a real movement of resistance to more satellite launches. I think that's the next frontier, the final frontier, if you will, of green politics, where it's going to be, you're going to hear a lot about space junk in the next few years, and about how there's too much floating around the Earth's orbit from old satellites and other debris that's up there that you won't be able to safely launch anymore, which I feel like, well, that's sort of some circular logic, but I don't understand what that has to do with, carbon emissions or the health of the planet, because it doesn't really. But it is going to be a frontier of green politics that you're going to start hearing about. I wouldn't be surprised if there are new nonprofits focusing on sort of anti-space, in the same way you sort of had effective altruists who are anti-AI that grew up a few years ago. So keep your eye out for that. I think you're going to hear more about it certainly by the end of the year.
Okay. Well, look, James, I can't thank you enough. I really appreciate your insight.
Yeah, absolutely.
And wish you the best. Thank you so.
Thanks for having me.